Jacob Miller sat in the cab of his old pickup truck, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was a bitter night in the Midwest of the United States, where the small town of Willow Creek nestled between endless cornfields. Snow fell thickly, blanketing the narrow mountain road, the headlights casting a faint glow through the white haze. Jacob turned on the radio, but only static mixed with fragments of hymns crackled from the local station. He murmured a familiar prayer. "Lord, keep me safe tonight." Willow Creek wasn't a place for dreamers. Life here revolved around three pillars: church, farm, and family. Jacob, 32, was a typical town man, tall, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair and deep blue eyes that always carried a serious glint. He worked the family farm, hauling goods in winter for extra cash. Above all, Jacob was devout. Every Sunday morning, he sat in the front pew at Pastor Grayson's Protestant church, absorbing long sermons about sin, salvation, and the importance of living righteously. Living righteously had been Jacob's compass since childhood. No drinking, no swearing, no associating with sinners. Rules he knew by heart. His father, Henry Miller, once told him, "Son, God sees everything. Live upright, and He'll open heaven's gates for you." Jacob believed it, or at least tried to. But tonight, as snow piled higher and the wind howled through the truck's cracked window, an emptiness gnawed at him. He'd done everything the church taught, so why did his heart feel so heavy? The mountain road grew steeper. Jacob slowed down, peering through the fogged windshield. He recalled yesterday's church meeting, Pastor Grayson's voice booming, "Those who don't live by God's law will burn in hellfire." Jacob wondered if he was truly safe. He'd missed a prayer meeting last week to fix the tractor, and the week before, he'd nearly cursed when he spilled a milk bucket. Were those small slips enough to push him out of God's grace? Suddenly, a deer darted from the roadside brush. Jacob slammed the brakes, but the icy road sent the truck skidding. He yelled, heart pounding as the vehicle veered, crashed through the guardrail and tumbled down the slope. Metal screeched, glass shattered, then everything went black. When Jacob opened his eyes, he wasn't in the truck anymore. No snow, no wind, just a cold, dark void surrounding him. He tried to stand, but his feet felt weightless, ungrounded. "Where am I?" he whispered, his trembling voice swallowed by the darkness. A chilling fear crept up his spine. God, what did I do wrong? The space around Jacob was unlike anything he'd known. It wasn't the golden-gated heaven or fiery hell the church described. It was an endless void, cold as the harshest Willow Creek winter, but silent. No wind, no sound, just oppressive stillness. He raised a hand to his face, but saw nothing through the thick blackness. "Am I dead?" he wondered, his inner voice echoing like a shout in a well. Jacob had imagined death as a clear moment. Either God would welcome him to heaven, or he'd be cast to hell for sins he'd tried to bury. But this place didn't fit either vision. He'd lived righteously, or so he thought. He didn't drink like Tommy, his childhood friend now shunned by the town. He didn't abandon church like Sarah, his old classmate living in the city. So why was he here in this darkness? A faint light flickered in the distance, like a flashlight veiled by fog. Then images appeared. Not vague memories, but vivid scenes playing like a film of his life. He saw himself in a black suit, sitting stiffly in church, nodding as Pastor Grayson preached about Judgment Day. He saw himself pushing a plow through the cornfields, sweat-soaked but proud of his duty. He saw himself teaching Sunday school, smiling as the kids recited verses. But then the scene shifted. Jacob saw himself outside the local bar, watching Tommy stumble out with a bottle. He remembered turning away, muttering, "He brought it on himself." He saw Sarah begging her parents forgiveness for leaving, but Jacob had advised them, "She chose a sinful path, don't go soft." He saw moments he'd refused to help others who didn't meet his righteous standards, like the homeless man at the corner, whom Jacob dismissed as lazy, not worth pity. His heart clenched. He wanted to shout that he'd only followed what he was taught, that he lived right to please God. But as the scenes unfolded, the truth pierced deeper. His pride had hurt others. He judged instead of loved, distanced instead of embraced. "God, I tried," he whispered, but the words dissolved into the void. The darkness thickened, heavier, as if draining the last of his strength. Jacob sank to his knees, unsure if there was ground beneath him. "If this is death, why don't I see you?" What did I do wrong? He closed his eyes, tears streaking his face. For the first time, he didn't pray the church's formula. From his core, he cried out, "Jesus, if you're real, save me." Silence engulfed Jacob after his desperate cry. He waited, heart hammering, but nothing happened at first. Then a tiny speck of light appeared far off, not the flickering glow from before, but a warm, steady beam, like his truck's headlights cutting through a blizzard. It grew, radiating heat that seeped into his frozen soul. The darkness recoiled, shrinking like a cornered animal. Jacob looked up, eyes wide as the light enveloped him. And then he saw him, a man standing before him, dressed in a simple flannel jacket and muddy work boots, but his face shone with indescribable beauty. His eyes were deep, piercing Jacob's soul, yet held no judgment, only love and gentleness. "Jacob," the voice said, soft but commanding, like wind rustling through autumn cornfields. "Why have you relied on your list of rules instead of trusting me?" Jacob opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to explain he tried to live right, that he attended church, worked hard, avoided sin. But under that gaze, excuses melted away. He knew he'd seen everything, not just his actions but the fears he'd hidden. I thought it was how to be accepted by you," Jacob stammered, voice breaking. "The church said if I lived right, you'd love me." The man Jesus stepped closer, kneeling beside Jacob. He placed a hand on his shoulder, and Jacob felt a warm strength flood through him. "Jacob, my love isn't a reward you earn. It's a gift I gave you long ago, even before you tried to be righteous. Rules won't save you. Only my grace can." Tears spilled from Jacob's eyes, hot against his cold cheeks. He recalled Pastor Grayson's sermons, the warnings of hellfire and judgment. He'd lived in fear of rejection, always striving to prove his worth. But now before Jesus, the truth hit hard. He didn't need to prove anything. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I was wrong. I thought I had to be perfect, but I was never good enough. I hurt people with my pride." Jesus smiled, a smile that melted every fear in Jacob's heart. "I know, Jacob, but I'm not here to condemn you. I'm here to save you. Stand up and let me show you the true path." Jacob took his hand, feeling like a child led by a father. As he rose, the light blazed brighter, banishing the darkness entirely. Fear was gone. Only peace remained, deep and complete, as if every wound in his soul had healed. The light wrapped Jacob like a warm blanket, but he knew he couldn't stay forever. Jesus stood before him, his eyes gentle yet resolute. "Jacob," he said, his voice steady as church bells on a Sunday morning, "I'm giving you a second chance. You've seen the truth, now live it." Jacob nodded, though he wasn't sure he grasped the full meaning. "What must I do, Lord?" he asked, voice trembling but determined. "Go back to Willow Creek," Jesus answered. "Many there are bound by fear and the pressure to live righteously, as you were. Share what you've seen, that my grace is enough, not their rules or efforts." Jacob hesitated. He thought of Pastor Grayson, his parents, the townsfolk who'd see him as a madman if he spoke of this. But what if they don't believe me? What if they turn against me? Jesus rested a hand on his shoulder again. "Some will reject you, even those you love most. But don't be afraid, Jacob. I'll be with you, and my strength will be perfect in your weakness." Before Jacob could ask more, the light shifted. New images appeared, not his past but a future. He saw himself in Willow Creek's community hall, speaking to a small group. There was Tommy, eyes teary but hopeful. There was Mrs. Mary, the elderly woman he'd once judged for missing church. They listened, and one by one they smiled, as if burdens lifted from their shoulders. Then the scenes darkened. His father, Henry, turning away in anger. Pastor Grayson pointing at him, calling him heretic. A crowd outside his house whispering accusations. Jacob's heart tightened, but Jesus' voice cut through. "Fear not, Jacob. I've gone before you." The light began to fade. Jacob felt his body lighten, as if pulled back to reality. He looked at Jesus one last time, etching his image into his mind. "I'll do what you say," he whispered. "I'll trust you." Then darkness returned. When Jacob opened his eyes again, he lay in a hospital bed, the beeping of machines filling his ears. Pain coursed through him, broken ribs, bandaged arm, but peace filled his soul. He'd survived, and he knew it wasn't by chance. Jacob awoke to the stark white light of Willow Creek General Hospital. His head throbbed, and each breath brought a sharp pang from his chest. A young nurse with a ponytail checked his her voice soft. "You're awake. You're lucky. The rescue team said your truck was totaled, but you only broke a few bones." Jacob nodded weakly, but his mind wasn't on survival. He thought of the light of Jesus, of the command to return and share. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. The door swung open, and his parents entered. Henry, tall with silver hair, led the way, his eyes worried but stern. Ruth, smaller, rushed to hug him. "God protected you, Jacob," she said, tears streaming. "We prayed all night." "Thanks, Mom," Jacob rasped, squeezing her hand. He looked at his father, still standing, hands in pockets. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Henry frowned. "What's so urgent it can't wait? You need rest." "No, I have to say it," Jacob insisted, his voice stronger than he expected. He took a deep breath and recounted everything. The crash, the darkness, the light, Jesus' words. He spoke of grace, how he'd realized rules didn't save him, only God's love did. When he finished, silence fell. Ruth stared, eyes wide, while Henry crossed his arms, his face hardening. "Jacob," he said slowly, "you were badly hurt. Maybe it was a dream." "It wasn't a dream, Dad," Jacob replied. "I've never been surer of anything." Henry shook his head. "The church teaches us to live upright for salvation. If you deny that, you're denying our family's faith." He turned and left without another word. Ruth looked at Jacob, then followed, leaving him alone with the machine's hum. Jacob lay back, closing his eyes. He knew this path wouldn't be easy, as Jesus had warned. But as he drifted off, he felt the warmth of that hand again. And he knew he wasn't alone. The next day, Tommy visited. His old friend looked haggard, hair messy, coat reeking of stale beer. "Heard you almost died," Tommy said, slumping into a chair. "You okay?" "Better than you think," Jacob smiled faintly. He told Tommy the story, holding nothing back. When he finished, Tommy bowed his head, silent for a long moment. "I'm tired, Jacob," he whispered. "Tired of being judged, tired of trying to fix myself and no one believing me. If God loves me, why don't I feel it?" Jacob gripped his hand. "Because you don't have to prove anything. He loves you right now as you are. I saw it." Tommy looked up, eyes red. "You really believe that?" "I do," Jacob said firmly. Tommy nodded, a flicker of hope in his gaze. Jacob knew this was just the start, but he felt it. The mission had begun. Jacob left the hospital after a week, his body still aching but his spirit stronger than ever. He returned to the family's small wooden house on Willow Creek's outskirts, where snow-draped cornfields stretched to the horizon. Ruth welcomed him with a tight hug and a bowl of hot chicken soup, but Henry only gave a curt nod before disappearing into the barn. Jacob knew his father was still angry, but he refused to let it sway him. That night, Jacob sat by the fireplace, flames crackling and casting shadows on his face. He held an old Bible, flipping to Romans. "For by grace you have been saved through faith." He read it over and over, feeling like he truly understood it for the first time. Before, it was just a verse to memorize. Now it was a living truth, the light that pulled him from darkness. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Jacob opened the door to find Tommy, his thick coat dusted with snow, hands trembling as he clutched a water bottle instead of liquor. "Didn't know where else to go," Tommy said, voice rough. "You meant it yesterday about God loving me. I want to hear more." Jacob smiled, pulling him inside. They sat by the fire and Jacob retold it all. The darkness, the light, Jesus' words. He spoke of grace, how Tommy didn't need to fix himself to be loved. Tommy listened, eyes watering but brightening with hope. "I quit drinking since yesterday," he whispered. "It's hard, but I want to try, 'cause you said he's with me." "He is," Jacob said, clapping his shoulder. "And so am I." Word of Jacob spread fast in a small town like Willow Creek. By week's end, he heard whispers at the general store. "Jacob Miller says he met God. He claims rules don't matter. Must have hit his head too hard." Some were curious, but most scoffed or avoided him. Jacob wasn't surprised. He'd been warned of rejection, but he didn't expect it to come so soon and so close. Sunday, Jacob went to church as usual, knowing what awaited. As he entered, eyes turned to him, some curious, some suspicious, some hostile. He took his usual seat, but this time he didn't bow his head out of habit. He wanted to face the truth head-on. Pastor Grayson, a tall, gaunt man with salt and pepper hair and a thunderous voice, stepped to the pulpit. He wore a black robe, clutching a thick Bible. Jacob had once revered him as a guide to God. Today he felt a chasm between them. The sermon began as usual: sin, judgment, the need for a holy life. But midway, Grayson paused, his sharp gaze sweeping the congregation before locking on Jacob. "There are those among us," he said slowly, "spreading dangerous lies. They say God's rules don't matter, that we don't need to live upright to be saved. This is the devil's word, not God's." Murmurs rippled through the church. Jacob felt heat rise in his neck, but he didn't look down. He knew it was about him. When the sermon ended, Grayson called him forward. "Jacob Miller," he said, voice icy, "do you have anything to say to this congregation?" Jacob stood, legs shaky but voice steadier than he'd expected. "Pastor, I don't deny the value of living well. But I saw Jesus, and he told me his grace is enough. It's not rules that save us, it's his love." Silence. Then whispers erupted like wine through the fields. Grayson's brow furrowed. "You dare say God's word in scripture is wrong? You dare place your experience above church doctrine?" "I'm not saying scripture's wrong," Jacob replied. "I'm saying we've misunderstood it. We live in fear, trying to earn what God gives freely." Grayson's face reddened. "Enough. If you don't repent, you're no longer welcome here." Jacob glanced around, saw Abigail's doubtful eyes, his mother's disappointment, his father's head shake. But he also saw Tommy at the back, nodding encouragement. He took a deep breath and walked out, feeling like he'd lost part of his life. Yet deep inside he knew he wasn't alone. Outside, snow fell again, covering his footprints like it wanted to erase his old path. Jacob stood under the gray sky, whispering, "Lord, guide me forward." Word of the standoff spread faster than a blizzard. When Jacob got home, Henry waited in the living room, his face stone-hard. Ruth stood behind, hands nervously clutching her apron. Abigail sat on the couch, eyes full of worry. "What did you do at church, Jacob?" Henry roared. "You shamed this family. Pastor Grayson called me, saying you're under heretical ideas." "I'm not a heretic, Dad," Jacob said, calm but firm. "I just spoke the truth I saw." "Truth?" Henry shouted. "The truth is you've lived your whole life righteously, and now you turn your back on it. You think you're wiser than the pastor, your parents, the church." Ruth stepped forward, touching her husband's arm. Henry calmed down. "Jacob just had an accident. Maybe he's still confused." "I'm not confused, Mom," Jacob said. "I met Jesus. He told me grace is enough, not a list of rules. I can't pretend I didn't see it." Abigail stood, voice trembling. "Jacob, I know you were hurt bad, but why not keep this to yourself? Why stir everything up?" "Because it's not just for me," Jacob replied. "Jesus told me to share it. How many people in this town live scared, thinking they're never good enough? I want them to know they're loved." Henry slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. If you keep this up, you're no longer my son. I didn't raise you to defy your family and faith." The words cut Jacob like a knife, but he didn't waver. He looked at his father, then his mother, then Abigail. "I don't want to lose you, but I can't go back to the old way, living in fear instead of love." Henry turned and stormed out, the door banging shut. Ruth sobbed quietly, and Abigail shook her head. Jacob stood there, feeling his life's foundation crumble. But within that loss, a small voice whispered, "I'm with you." After the family clash, Jacob moved to the old barn on the farm, a few hundred yards from the main house. He needed space to think, to pray. Each night he sat by the window watching snow fall, feeling Jesus' presence like a small flame warming his soul. Tommy became his first companion. They met nightly in the barn, with a lantern and the tattered Bible. Jacob read to Tommy, explaining that God didn't judge him for his past but loved him as he was. Tommy began to change. He quit drinking for a week, then two, though his hands still shook with cravings. "You're right, Jacob," he said one night. "I feel lighter, like someone actually cares." One afternoon, Mrs. Mary, an elderly woman from nearby, knocked on the barn door. She'd once taught Sunday school but rarely attended church now due to frail health. "I heard about you," she said, eyes bright behind thick glasses. "I want to know more about this Grace you talk about." Jacob welcomed her in, retelling his story. Mrs. Mary listened, then smiled. "I've spent my life trying to be right, but I always feared I wasn't enough. If you're telling the truth, it's what I've waited for." Word spread slowly. A small group began gathering in the barn: Tommy, Mrs. Mary, and a few curious others. They weren't the righteous by Willow Creek standards. Some had left church, others bore bad reputations. But they came because they sensed something different in Jacob, not judgment but hope. At each meeting, Jacob shared what he'd learned from Jesus. He didn't preach like Grayson. He told stories about the darkness, the light, and unconditional love. Gradually, he saw Grace's seed sprout. Tommy laughed more, Mrs. Mary sang hymns with real joy. But not everyone approved. One night, as Jacob prayed alone, he heard footsteps outside. A group of young men from the church stood there, holding wooden bats, eyes blazing. "What are you doing with these people, Jacob?" one shouted. "You're leading them astray." Jacob stepped out, voice calm. "I'm not leading anyone astray. I'm just telling the truth I saw." "Traitor!" another yelled, hurling a rock through the window. Glass shattered, but Jacob didn't flinch. He looked at them, heart heavy but fearless. "God loves you all," he said, then turned back inside, leaving them in the cold dark. Hostility in the town grew. Pastor Grayson publicly denounced Jacob in sermons, calling him a sower of chaos. Many refused to sell him goods at the store, and rumors swirled through Willow Creek that he was demon-possessed, starting a cult. Yet his small group persisted, now including a single mother, Lisa, shunned by the church for her divorce, and Ben, a young man who'd returned after running away. One night, as the group prayed in the barn, the lantern's light flickered. Jacob looked up, seeing a red glow outside. Someone had set fire to a haystack nearby, and flames spread fast in the cold wind. "Get out now!" Jacob yelled, ushering everyone to safety. They stood outside, watching the fire consume the barn. Jacob's only home since leaving his family. Tommy gripped his arm. "What do we do now?" he asked, voice shaking. Jacob stared at the flames, then at the people around him. Tommy, Mrs. Mary, Lisa, Ben. They didn't run, didn't abandon him despite the danger. He smiled, though his heart ached. "We keep going," he said. "God didn't bring us here for nothing." That night, they moved the meeting to Mrs. Mary's cramped living room. Jacob stood, voice low but strong. "They can burn the barn, but they can't burn what God put in our hearts. We don't need a perfect place. We need each other and Him." Lisa sobbed. "I've never felt accepted like this." "Thank you, Jacob." Ben nodded. "I thought God hated me. Now I know He doesn't." Jacob looked at them, feeling the strength Jesus promised, strength in weakness. The fire outside might destroy everything, but the fire in his heart burned brighter than ever. He knew the road ahead was long, but he was no longer afraid. After the barn fire, Jacob and his small group became the center of attention in Willow Creek. Not in a good way. Rumors spread like winter winds, branding him an outcast in the eyes of most townsfolk. People who once greeted him at the general store now turned away. Children whispered behind his back, calling him the crazy man who met God. But Jacob didn't let it shake him. He remembered Jesus' words. "Some will reject you, but do not be afraid." The group continued meeting at Mrs. Mary's house, crammed into her tiny living room with creaky chairs and the faint scent of cookies lingering in the air. Tommy was now Jacob's most steadfast companion, bringing along a tattered Bible he'd fished out of the trash behind his house. Lisa, the single mother, brought her shy daughter Emma, who started smiling more often. Ben, the young man who'd once run away from home, sat quietly but listened intently. And Mrs. Mary, with her frail but heartfelt hymns, became the group's spiritual anchor. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside, Jacob stood among them. "We don't have much," he said, his voice warm and steady, "but we have each other, and we have God. That's all we need." He retold his story, not to boast but to remind them and himself that grace didn't depend on circumstances. Lisa looked up, her eyes glistening. "I used to think God hated me because I got divorced. The church said I was a failure. But hearing you, I'm starting to believe He still loves me." He does, Jacob replied. Not because of what you do, but because you're his child. Tommy nodded. I've been off the bottle for 3 weeks now. It's not easy, but every time I want to go back, I remember you said he's with me. Jacob smiled, his heart warming despite the gray sky outside. But that joy didn't last. The next day, a letter was slipped under Mrs. Mary's door. No signature, just scrawled handwriting. Stop this now, or it won't just be the barn that burns. Jacob held the letter, his hands trembling. He knew it wasn't an empty threat. But as he looked at his group, he saw resolve in their eyes. We don't stop, he said. No one can extinguish what God has started. March in Willow Creek was still frigid, though the snow began to melt, leaving muddy puddles on the roads. The hostility toward Jacob didn't thaw with the ice. A group from the church, led by the Carter brothers, 2 burly young men who'd thrown rocks at the barn, started lingering near Mrs. Mary's house every evening the group met. They didn't do anything beyond staring, but their presence was a silent warning. Pastor Grayson escalated his attacks. In Sunday sermons, he called Jacob a betrayer of the faith, warning the congregation that people like him will lead your souls to the abyss. Jacob no longer attended church, but the pastor's words reached him through Abigail, his sister, the only family member still speaking to him. Abigail visited him one afternoon, bringing a tin of cookies from their mother. Dad doesn't know I'm here, she said softly. He's still angry, but Mom's worried about you. So am I, Jacob. What are you doing? Why don't you apologize to Pastor Grayson and come back? Jacob met her gaze, his blue eyes unwavering. Abigail, I can't go back to living in fear. I saw Jesus and he told me to share grace. Have you ever wondered? If we live right but still don't feel peace, what does that mean? Abigail fell silent, then sighed. I don't know, Jacob. I just want our family to be like it was. So do I, Jacob said. But I can't pretend. That night, the final winter storm hit. Not a blizzard, but a storm of human rage. As Jacob's group prayed, a furious pounding shook the door. Jacob opened it to find the Carter brothers and a few others, armed with sticks and flashlights. We told you to stop, one growled. No more running now. They stormed in, smashing Mrs. Mary's small room. Tommy lunged to shield Jacob but took a blow and fell. Lisa screamed, clutching Emma while Ben froze. Jacob raised his hands, his voice calm amid the chaos. Stop! What do you want? Beating us will change what? Jed Carter, the leader, jabbed a finger at him. You're ruining this town, Jacob Miller. You're making people doubt the church, doubt God. I'm not doubting God, Jacob said. I'm doubting the way we live, like he's a taskmaster with a checklist. He loves you no matter what you do. Jed hesitated, then turned away, leading the group out in a fury. The room lay in ruins, broken chairs, shattered windows, Tommy's Bible torn further. But no one gave up. Mrs. Mary took Jacob's hand, her voice shaky but firm. We'll get through this, son. After the attack, Jacob's group didn't retreat. They cleaned up Mrs. Mary's house, fixing what they could, and kept meeting. Word of the incident spread, but this time it carried a different breeze. A few townsfolk, once on the sidelines, grew curious. They came to Mrs. Mary's not to judge, but to listen. One was Sarah, Jacob's old schoolmate who'd left Willow Creek for the city. She'd returned to visit family, heard about Jacob, and stopped by. I can't believe you're doing this, she said, sitting in the cramped living room. You used to be the most rigid person I knew. Jacob chuckled. I've changed, Sarah. I thought being right was everything. Now I know it's not. Sarah listened to his story, eyes wide. I left the church because I couldn't stand the pressure. If you're telling the truth about God loving me even when I'm not perfect, that's what I need to hear. Sarah wasn't alone. An older man, Mr. Bill, a former friend of Jacob's father, came too. He'd abandoned church after his wife's death, believing God had punished him. If you're right, he whispered. Maybe I've misunderstood him. The small group wasn't small anymore. They moved their meetings to the old community hall, rarely used by others. Each night dozens arrived, not for long sermons but to hear Jacob's story, to feel the unconditional love he spoke of. Tommy shared his journey off alcohol. Lisa talked about finding hope for her daughter, and Mrs. Mary sang hymns with newfound strength. But this growth didn't escape Pastor Grayson's notice. He called an emergency meeting with the church elders, inviting Mr. Henry. "We must end this," Grayson said. "Jacob is splitting the community." Mr. Henry, silent until then, spoke up. "I don't know my son anymore, but I don't want him hurt more. Isn't there another way?" Pastor Grayson shook his head. "If he doesn't stop, we'll have to exile him from Willow Creek." The community hall meetings became a beacon in the cold winter. Over 50 people came each night, sitting on rickety folding chairs, listening to Jacob and his group. They weren't just the broken. Some were once loyal churchgoers who now felt something missing in their faith. Jacob didn't preach like a pastor. He told stories, shared, and invited them to pray together. It felt like the vision Jesus had shown him coming to life. But the final storm arrived. One evening, as Jacob spoke in the hall, the doors burst open. Pastor Grayson strode in, followed by Mr. Henry and a group of elders. Whispers ceased, the air thick with tension. "Jacob Miller," Grayson boomed, his voice echoing. "You've gone too far. You're dividing the church, leading people astray. I demand you stop now, or leave Willow Creek." Jacob stood, meeting his gaze. "Pastor, I don't want to divide anyone. I just want people to know they're loved, not because they're perfect, but because God loves them." Mr. Henry stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "Jacob, son, I don't understand you anymore. But I don't want to lose you. Come back, apologize to the pastor, and we can forget this." Jacob looked at his father, his heart aching. "Dad, I can't go back to living in fear. I saw Jesus and he told me to walk this path. I won't apologize for the truth." Grayson raised a hand. "Then you have no place here. Leave town or we'll make you." Murmurs erupted in the crowd. Tommy stood. "If Jacob goes, I go." Mrs. Mary, Lisa, Ben, Sarah. One by one they rose, their eyes resolute. Nearly half the hall stood with Jacob. A silent but powerful declaration. Mr. Henry looked around, his face paling. He turned to Grayson. "Don't you see? This isn't division. It's something bigger." Grayson stiffened but said nothing. He turned and led the elders out, leaving Mr. Henry standing there, staring at his son. Jacob stepped forward, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "I don't want to lose you, but I have to do this." Mr. Henry said nothing, but for the first time in months, he didn't walk away. Spring arrived in Willow Creek, bringing gentle rains and tender green shoots to the cornfields. Jacob wasn't exiled. The support from his group was too strong, forcing Pastor Grayson and the elders to back off. But the town remained divided. Some stayed loyal to the pastor, others sought Jacob at the community hall. Jacob didn't build a new church. He didn't want to replace Grayson or start an institution. He just wanted a place where people could find grace, healing the wounds fear had left behind. The hall became an informal gathering spot where people, from Tommy, now fully sober, to Sarah, who chose to stay in Willow Creek, shared their stories. One afternoon, Mr. Henry came to the hall. Jacob was fixing a broken chair when his father walked in, carrying an old toolbox. "I don't understand everything you say," Mr. Henry began, his voice halting, "but I see my son in these people's eyes. I want to try listening if you'll still have me." Jacob smiled, tears streaming down. "I've always wanted you here." Mr. Henry joined the group, not with full agreement, but with an openness Jacob had never seen in him. Mrs. Ruth followed soon after, bringing cookies and hugs. Abigail remained hesitant, but she started asking Jacob questions instead of judging. The town didn't change entirely. Pastor Grayson still preached about judgment, and many still shunned Jacob. But new footprints appeared on the snowy paths, footprints of those finding freedom in grace. Tommy opened a small auto repair shop, using his earnings to help the poor. Lisa began teaching a class for orphan kids. Sarah wrote a short book about her journey, sending it across the Midwest. One night, Jacob stood outside the hall, gazing at the star-filled sky. He recalled the headlights in the darkness, Jesus' voice echoing, "I am with you always." He knew he wasn't perfect. Some days he doubted, some days he grew weary. But he was no longer afraid. He'd found the truth, and it had set him free. Jacob whispered into the night, "Thank you." And beneath the vast sky, the headlights in his heart shone on.